Hello, and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast, where you can learn powerful techniques to change the way you feel. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski, and joining me here in the Murrieta studio is Dr. David Burns. Dr. David Burns is a pioneer in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy and the creator of the new teen therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 30 languages. David is currently an emeritus adjunct professor of clinical psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Rhonda.
And hi, Dave.
Hey, Rhonda and David.
Hi, Dave.
Hey, do you go by Dave or only David?
In college, they called me Burnsy. You can
Burnsy.
call me whatever you want.
I like that.
It's
I kinda
more
like that,
often
Burnsy.
David than Dave.
Yeah. Well, we're going to do another Ask David in this episode, and we're actually kind of following up on the week before last week's Ask David. But first, this podcast is going to be published on December 23rd, so we want to wish people
Happy Hanukkah.
starting on the 22nd, and we're going to wish people a
Merry Christmas.
and whatever other holiday you celebrate, we wish you a happy holiday season.
Thank you, Rhonda.
David, you would make a great Santa.
Yeah. You mean because I'm getting fat?
No, you just have the look with the beard and everything. Yeah. You just,
Actually, my happiest holiday is Thanksgiving.
Yeah, me
I'm
too.
with you on that.
I'm
Because
totally with you.
it's family, it's food, it's being together. There's no commercial
No,
push.
yeah, no pressure to buy stuff. And anyway, so we ended our last podcast, 171, talking about physical pain and if it's true that negative feelings can make physical pain worse. And you told us that really interesting story about how you got hit with the bottle in a bar and the comfort that the plastic surgeon gave you reduced your pain from whatever it was to almost down to nothing. And when we turned off the recording, Dave,
You had a
really
clarified
comment.
that in an important way.
Well, I just, in addition, Rhonda pointed out the doctor that was with you was providing empathy, but, also that I'm imagining that you felt a lot of fear around, is this going to be disfiguring? You're a young man, and
That's right.
And that him telling you like, hey, this is routine, whatever, that the fear going away may also have had a lot to do with it too.
Yes, the compassion was great, but that's not really what caused the pain to disappear. What caused, and I'm so glad you made that point, and what my research showed and what the fact was that my anxiety suddenly went to zero. Because I was afraid I was going to be losing my teeth. I believed that he'd take care of the broken jaw.
Yeah.
And that was comforting. That reduced my anxiety. This isn't some horrible thing. But then also, when he says everything's going to be fine and your teeth are going to be fine, and I just, I can relax now. I don't have to worry. Life is good again.
Yeah.
And then that's when the pain disappeared. It was the reduction in negative emotions like depression, anxiety, and anger. That reduction in negative feelings can have a powerful effect in reducing, and in some cases, completely eliminating physical pain.
And just in pushing this one step further, so what if, let's say what if there had been more of a chance you're going to lose your teeth, and the doctor hadn't been able to reassure you on that? What might have been a cognitive approach to still get to the low pain, even though you still have some fear?
I'd have to think about that. That's like a new patient with a new, different problem, and we'd be doing a daily mood log and looking at cognitive distortions and doing paradoxical agenda setting. One thing I never like to do is to throw a solution at a problem.
Okay.
I had a story too.
Yes, and yours is a great one. Yes.
Almost kind of the opposite. But well, one of the things you don't know about me is I have a 3rd degree black belt in Shaolin Kempo karate, and partly that it's so on my 2nd degree black belt test, which was about probably 10 years ago, I had to spar after about 6 hours of doing pretty hard calisthenics and running and forms, and I was physically tired, and I was probably like 49 when I took this test, and when it was time to spar, 5 young men in their early 20s who just probably woke up and came in and were like all rested, and I had to spar them, and I was tired, and I made some mistakes, and somebody knocked me in the nose and broke my nose, and I was knocked unconscious. And I'm not really supposed to talk about it, but anyway, when I became conscious again, it only lasted a few moments. It wasn't like a huge concussion. But anyway, when I became conscious again, it was blood all over the place, which of course I didn't see because I'm not looking at myself. And I'm like really excited and really happy and eager to finish the test so that I could get my black belt. And I felt no pain.
Yeah.
And nobody around me was looking at me going, oh, you okay? Are you okay? Oh, you're bloody all over the place. So we're just like, get up, put your gloves, stop whining. Not that I was whining, but, get up, let's go. And so I finished the sparring and I got my black belt. And then afterward, my second black belt.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, just to clarify.
Second degree, yeah.
Second degree, yeah.
But not your last.
Not my last, no. But anyway, I went over and looked in the mirror and was like, oh my God. And then I started to feel a pain.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because I saw the blood all over my face and I was like, oh my God, my nose is broken.
Getting anxious.
And I started getting anxious.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's powerful that the brain is far more powerful than we think.
Yeah.
In changing the way we feel physically as well as psychologically, and that rapid changes are possible when you have a sudden change in the way you think and feel.
If only Rhonda had been there on the mean streets of Palo Alto to protect you from that.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I'll protect you the next time we're walking the streets. Well, here's another question for you that we didn't get a chance to ask last week. And that is it true that emotional trauma affects the brain? And this is from Jackie, who's written before. She's an educational consultant, and she writes, "Hi again, Dr. Burns. I love the 5 secrets and have had great success in my new job by implementing them. I keep listening to all the 5 Secrets podcasts over and over to keep it fresh for me and really love the podcast on advanced techniques. My question today is about how trauma affects the brain. Trauma is the new buzzword in education, and psychologists are creating presentations geared for teachers and other school professionals that claim the trauma-affected brain is altered and cannot learn as easily. They allege imaging technology can prove this. Do you know if PTSD trauma actually impacts a person's ability to learn? I thought that it was the negative thoughts that interfere with attitudes toward learning, not an actual brain impairment. Another term that is used frequently is intergenerational trauma, meaning if my parent experienced trauma, it could be passed down to me and therefore impact my ability to cope with life's stressors. Any thoughts? Any credible research you're aware of? In the Ask David episode, could you also include your opinion on how adverse childhood experiences impact people's mental health and ability to cope? There are a range of experiences cited in studies from moving around a lot in childhood to witnessing a murder to molestation. After listening to your podcast, episode 147, when Gary talked about the PTSD he experienced, I was satisfied with the effectiveness of team to treat trauma rapidly. But then I remembered a documentary I had seen about quote-unquote feral children who were extremely neglected as children, and I wondered if there are some cases where the psychology or the potential of a person is forever impacted by an adverse childhood experience. Your take?
And then she's an educational consultant for what we have disguised as the Mountaintop School Division. And those are cool questions, and I'll babble a little about each of the 3 things, and you guys can throw in your 2 cents worth on it. I'm kind of have pretty strong negative emotional reactions, anger and frustration and annoyance, when people throw around buzzwords. Like trauma is the new buzzword in education, Jackie writes, and that somehow this affects your brain, which is altered and you cannot learn as easily, and that allege imaging technology can prove this. Just as a physician, I'm a board certified I'm certified by the Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, and while I'm all in favor of research, when I read claims like this, I find them personally offensive and not consistent with my knowledge or my experience. I mean, certainly if someone's had severe trauma, they say been in Afghanistan and a bomb blows up and they get, a brain syndrome. They're knocked unconscious and they're getting, brain damage. that's certainly a physical injury. But people are just talking about traumatic experiences growing up, and what I've treated so many trauma patients in my career, and the interesting thing is, of all the patients I've ever treated, trauma patients are by far the easiest to treat and the quickest to learn the things that I'm trying to teach. I did a trauma workshop the last several years all over the US and Canada, and I probably treated 40 or 50 people live in each workshop. I treated a live volunteer, and they all had severe trauma, rapes, multiple horrible auto accidents. I had a woman who was kidnapped by a serial killer. Pretty extreme kinds of things, and every single person recovered pretty much completely from their depression and anxiety in a single therapy session lasting roughly an hour and a half to 2 hours. So I just haven't seen this kind of claim in reality, and working in the trenches with massive numbers of trauma patients. But also, to tell someone you have a trauma-affected brain that is altered and cannot learn as easily would seem to me to create a kind of a negative mindset on the part of the student, which doesn't sound very encouraging to me.
Well, I think she's referring to the study that Kaiser did in the 1990s, where they asked all their patients, or during a certain time period, about the negative experiences that they had experienced.
Yeah.
And then compared them to, and just like she said, they could have been, witnessing a murder, or your parents' divorce, or frequent moves, or other. I think there's 18 identified adverse childhood experiences, and then they're correlated with poor physical and mental health in adulthood. Like, the more ACEs you've experienced, the worse your outcome is in terms of your physical and mental health. It's also in the news, and I don't know if she's from California. I don't think she is, but Nadine Burke-Harris, who our Governor Newsom appointed the first state Surgeon General. There's a federal Surgeon General. She's the only Surgeon General for the state, and she's a pediatrician who's done a lot of research on adverse childhood experiences, and she is advocating now that anytime someone goes to a medical appointment, that they get screened for what they've experienced, which provides a lot of information to the medical provider that they're seeing. And what you're saying is, because you've experienced, and like somebody was like, oh, you've experienced all these traumatic things, you're doomed.
Yeah, exactly.
And what you're saying is, you've had these experiences. In my experiences,
the more
you're
trauma
not doomed.
you've had, the easier it's going to be to get you to a state of joy and euphoria and get over the depression and anxiety. I did an informal study at Stanford when I was validating my easy diagnostic system. And we studied 178 consecutively treated, admitted patients to the psychiatric inpatient unit. And one of the scales I had to validate was my PTSD scale, which was one of the screening scales, because we're trying to assign diagnoses to the patients. And on the page before they filled out the symptoms of PTSD, I asked, if you had any severe, significant traumas in your life. And I thought, a few patients would have some ultra severe trauma. And I don't think there was a single patient that didn't list at least 20 traumatic events.
Right.
And it wasn't true that there's some subset of patients that have had some severe trauma. All human beings have had trauma. Now, I've had two of the worst traumatic events in my life in the last 4 weeks. Very disturbing things have happened to me. And I'm not pleading to be a victim. Both things turned out great, and one of them led to a wonderful deepening of a relationship with a colleague. But they were very, very painful and disturbing to me. But to me, this gives us opportunities for growth, for learning, for developing greater intimacy, and also I started my career as a full-time researcher. I do reviews are sent to me from research journals to say, is this article worthy of publication? And when I see research reported by the media and gets popular, I shouldn't say this because I'll sound like a grouch, but I never ask the question, what does this research mean? What's the interpretation? I ask the question, was this research worth publishing?
Mm-hmm.
Is it validly done? And the answer to that, 99% of the time, it's no.
Wow.
And that's frustrating to me too,
Yeah.
because people, they just want to cite research. My wife, who's way smarter than I am, is a PhD in clinical psychology, and is the most brilliant, aside from yourself, the most brilliant psychologist I've ever
And Jill. Love it.
and Jill, yeah, encountered. And I asked her the same question, and she said she too, she doesn't follow research anymore because she doesn't think there's any valid research in our field, hardly any at all. And that's probably a slight overstatement, but I'm tired of people throwing away these buzzwords, pretending they know something.
But I really like what you're saying, that we all experience negative experiences, and it's not an automatic like death sentence or like automatic, oh, you're going to have a horrible adulthood, because it's hopeful that there's positive results can still occur.
Powerful tools to change the way you think and change the way you feel. Have you ever had any traumatic events, Dave?
I was thinking a long time ago, I took this 2-day workshop that involved, where it was a number of people, and people would share about things that had happened with them, and there was a lot of talk about what happened in childhood, and the gamut of things that people shared was from someone whose father wasn't maybe as loving as they would have preferred, to someone who was like raped and molested by their uncle or whatever.
Yeah.
What was interesting was that the level of trauma, quote unquote, that people experienced seemed to be completely like that person who had comparatively minor trauma would have experienced the same level of emotional disruption as the other person. It was just amazing to me how like the event had nothing to do with the.
I love what you're saying. When I was in Philadelphia, I had a hand injury playing tennis, and it was wrongly put in a cast for 6 months because this orthopedic guy who wasn't very good diagnosed a fracture that didn't exist. And when he took the cast off, I had what's called reflex sympathetic dystrophy, or regional pain syndrome, which is supposed to be a hopeless disorder. It's excruciating pain, and I had almost complete paralysis in my hand. The bones were paper thin.
Oh no.
And it's this horrible disorder, and the only hopeful treatment is constant movement, really 18 to 24 hours a day of therapy. I even had to have therapy when I was asleep.
Oh, wow.
I had to put my hand in a machine that kept moving it. And I had to, even when I was seeing patient, I had to be doing exercises to bring it back. But it was such an interesting experience. And then I'd go to the hand gymnasium at Penn Hospital and do hand workouts with other patients with hand injuries. And it was so interesting that there were people there with the most grotesque hand injuries. Unbelievable. There was a woman, elderly woman, who redoes paintings. She restores these super expensive paintings. Her hands were so destroyed by arthritis. She could barely move them, her fingers, and she was still doing this fantastic work, and she was just filled with joy.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a boy I was working with, working out on machines, and I said, "Oh yeah, where are you from?" He said, "Oh, I go to high school here in South Philadelphia." And I said, "What are you hoping to be when you grow up?" He said, "Oh, I want to be an NBA player. I love basketball. I'm going to make it in the NBA." And I said, "Oh, well, what injury are you here for?" He says, "Well, my hands were cut off in shop." And they threw his hands in a bucket of ice water and rushed him to Penn, and they had just sewn his hands back on.
Oh my goodness.
And he was just totally happy, and he says, "I'm learning, I'm starting to move my fingers now," and stuff like that. And worse, I saw people even worse than that who were so happy. A professional famous skier, and his hand had been run over and smashed flat.
Wow.
And so he was going to have some thing attached to his arm that the ski pole could go. But they were optimistic, joyful people. But then there were these people who were whiners and complainers with really minor injuries. So it's exactly what you're saying, that the attitude was everything.
Yeah. My first job out of graduate school, I worked at San Francisco's Rape Trauma Center, where adults would be raped, call the police, and they would be in our center. And that happened there too. Like if somebody thought, I did everything I could to protect myself, they felt better, they felt good about themselves and what they did, and they healed much faster.
Yeah, right.
Than someone who said, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that, and then questioned themselves and felt badly about themselves, not just the event.
Finally, I'll just mention this term, intergenerational trauma, meaning if your parent experienced trauma, well, all parents in the United States and Guatemala, according to the Buddha 2,500 years ago, have experienced a minimum of 30 traumatic events. All humans get traumatized all the time. So if your parents had trauma, it'll be passed down to me and therefore impact my ability to cope with life stressors. That is the goofiest thing. Again, it's so offensive. Oh, there's intergenerational trauma. Oh, you're inheriting trauma from your parents. You're doomed. It's so stupid. I went to
But wait. I mean, I'm not a research expert in any way whatsoever, but there is research, which I shouldn't cite, and I don't know, where like people who came out of the Holocaust, who survived a concentration camp and then had children, their children had some of the same symptoms that they had, even though they were, born without ever experiencing that kind of thing.
We all have stories, and our stories affect us, and that's absolutely true. But this, you have intergenerational trauma, that this is going to have this effect on you. It just
kind of, I can see how that really bugs you.
Mental garbage to me. I went. You have to stay humble. I went to a workshop in Canada, and it was just blow away. I thought, oh, these people are so impressed. I did such a great job, and these two women offered to drive me to the airport, and they were so excited about my workshop. I said, oh yeah, thank you, I'd love it. And then they were saying, oh, your workshop was so great, and you're so great, and oh, by the way, have you heard about this reincarnation therapy that we're doing? And yes, you need to add it to your team CBT. You see, we hypnotize our patients and bring them back to their previous lives.
Wow.
And it's so great. And I had a patient yesterday who discovered she'd actually been Cleopatra and how that's affected her sexual life. And so I was like, oh, give me a break. People are just believing goofy things. And these are mental health professionals. And I don't mean to be critical of them, although I certainly do mean to be critical of them. It's just, one of these days, we're going to develop a science of psychotherapy and get away from these fads and these cults and these buzzwords and get down to science.
Well, you already are.
That's what we're trying to create.
That's what we're trying to do.
And,
testing.
I could see a mechanism. The intergenerational thing where it's a how we think about things can be a learned behavior. So
absolutely.
Like if your parent is in a bad car accident and then is very anxious and doesn't like to drive or whatever that
teach you to be anxious.
Yeah, they will teach you to be anxious.
Absolutely. And our little cat, certainly if you've had bad experiences, you could be a little feral kid to a certain extent. And my wife and I adopt feral cats, and some of them are very timid and afraid of noises. And when they first come to us, they try to bite us, and they've had bad experiences, and they growl, and then we love them and give them team CBT and turn them into loving little people, which always seems to work. But of course our experiences can affect us.
Okay, so we only have 10 minutes, but we have 2 more questions.
Okay.
So here's the next question. Dr. Burns, what's displacement? Is it true that you have to have a good cry when something traumatic happens? That's the umbrella question. Hi there again. I've been practicing team CBT for a year, while at the same time studying Dr. Gordon Neufeld's theories on the need for tears of futility for true healing, including adaptation, maturation, and development of resilience. He states that if we only work on the cognitive level, we risk just displacing the symptoms in our clients, and they would miss out on maturation and adaptation. I am wondering if you have ever seen a displacement of the symptoms in treating your patients with team CBT. In most of the live sessions I've seen with you, you seem to have this gift or skill to make it safe for the client to let the tears flow, and that this often seems to be the moment when a breakthrough is about to happen. So I wonder if you think the client needs to shed tears, or at least feel the feelings of futility or true sadness, before we should move forward toward methods in addition to getting perfect empathy scores. And what role do you think tears play in the healing process? Thanks.
Well, I'll make my
millennia.
contribution short, although I have a bunch of bullet points for the show notes. But I think that tears can be wonderful in therapy, and they show that the patient trusts the therapist. And during the empathy phase of Team CBT, I think it's great if the tears flow to develop a bond between the therapist and patient. And when you cry, you're saying to the therapist, I trust you, and I'm willing to show my vulnerability. So I think that's great. I always get a little suspicious when people say this thing has to happen in certain kind of patients, because everyone has a different path to enlightenment, and I work with the individual, not some rule book that says this or that has to happen at this or that phase of therapy. And I've had plenty of patients who recovered completely without some tearful phase in the treatment. What are
But
your
I also
thoughts?
thinking that she's kind of buying, I don't know, but it sounds like she's kind of buying into a myth that when you do cognitive behavioral therapy, it's only about your thoughts and we ignore feelings.
Yeah,
But Team CBD is
which is so nonsensical.
it's interwoven, your feelings and your
Yeah,
thoughts.
absolutely. Yeah, the feelings are crucial. In the empathy phase,
Yeah.
you're trying to encourage the patient to share feelings and to acknowledge the feelings and not to help them and to be them with them. I treated a woman that we might have talked about on a previous podcast, but she'd had horrible trauma for decades, and just during the empathy phase, I almost didn't have to say anything, and she talked and cried and we connected, and that there was just beautiful bonding that happened. Did that cure her? No. Crying is never going to cure anyone of anything, but it allows you to use powerful tools that can cure the patient, but you need more than just empathy and tears to
Yeah, because
transform
you're not a
someone's
robot. The
life.
therapist isn't a robot.
No.
A patient can't come to you and say, "Oh, I need help with XYZ," and you go, "Okay, here's the formula. Tell me about your negative thoughts. It's all over. Let's go do some exposure,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah." I mean, it is about
Yeah.
trusting you, and
Yeah.
sometimes you trust someone after you've sat in the room and cried with them, and sometimes
Yeah.
you trust someone if you sit in the room and just talk about what it is you're experiencing.
Yeah.
And then, that trust and that bond between therapist and patient can lead to the other work.
Good therapy is magic, and magic is multi-layered.
Exactly.
And simplistic formulas are pretty
Yeah.
much always going to fall
Right.
short.
Dave?
I don't have much to add other than I imagine that when I've I don't cry very much, which is probably not great. I think that there's an honest, if it's true, if it's like you're saying, there's an honesty to it. I remember I dated a woman once who cried, not all the time, but sometimes, and it was always touching for me because it wasn't histrionic. She was doing it, like there was something. It was just an honest expression of how she was feeling, and I appreciated that.
Yeah, I love that. And also some people have raised the question, can a therapist cry during a session? And we had a Stanford resident, a brilliant guy, an MD, PhD, who came to the Tuesday group once, and he had led a group at the VA hospital, and the veterans started to open up about the things they'd experienced in Vietnam or Afghanistan. And he said he heard things that just blew his mind. It was so horrible, and tears started going down his cheeks. And then he came to the Tuesday group, and he was all ashamed of himself and saying maybe a therapist shouldn't cry. And I said, in my opinion, what you just described was the greatest way a therapist could be, and I just bow down to you that this showing your tears, and it made a great impact on the group too. I mean, they really appreciated it. A lot of them veterans started crying. But emotion is nothing, not something to be afraid of, but something to be cherished. And sometimes tears can be a form of enlightenment. I think that sadness without distorted thoughts, if sadness comes from valid thoughts, it's a form of enlightenment or spirituality to cry. But most of the time when people cry, they're having contaminated by distorted thoughts like guilt and I should have done this, and I'm angry about my dead father because of this or that, and that that takes away the positive dimension. That's fortunately that's easy to treat too. But I think, when I cry personally, I'm just so grateful.
Okay, well, thank you both for that. Here's our last question. Why does avoidance make anxiety worse? Hi, Dr. Burns. I love your show and your work so much. I can't wait to buy Feeling Great. There's a question I've had for about 3 years that I've badly wanted to get my head wrapped around. It's in regard to something I've heard you say, but I've heard others say so too. For example, on the Feeling Good episode 116, at about 28 minutes into the episode, someone said, most experts in exposure therapy or behavior therapy say that attempts to control your symptoms of anxiety is the cause of all anxiety. Why is this? I understand if you push through an anxiety, you can learn whether it's warranted or not. But how is trying to avoid an anxiety actually the cause of all anxiety? I want to be able to understand it, for when I feel myself trying to move away from social anxiety, I can understand at a moment's notice why doing so actually is the cause of all my anxiety. To be able to skewer through
to skewer the rationalizations.
Oh, to skewer the rationalizations in my mind of why I shouldn't push through. Thank you, David. Best regards, Mark.
Well, I'm eager to get you folks' thoughts about this. When you confront your fear, it's kind of based on the teachings from that goofy Tibetan Book of the Dead.
I'm sorry.
That when you confront your worst fear, you discover the monster has no teeth, and you go into a state of euphoria, really, because you find out what you're afraid of. It wasn't worth, there was nothing there, and it's a spiritual principle at the core of Buddhism. It's also at the core of Christianity, probably Jewish religion as well. Walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. These are all spiritual messages. But when you turn away from the anxiety, see, anxiety is caused by distorted thoughts about reality. Mm-hmm. So when you turn away, when you run away, your distorted thoughts mushroom, and there's no reality to stop them. And I can give you a quick example of that, when I was young, I wasn't afraid of heights, but my mother had the fear of heights. And then as a teenager, out of the blue, I developed this intense fear of heights, and I have no idea where it came from. And then I got over it. Sophomore year in high school, a teacher had me stand at the top of a tall ladder until my anxiety disappeared. And after 15 minutes, the anxiety disappeared. And then after that, for years, I had no fear of heights. In fact, when I was doing construction labor, I used to go up at the top of tall buildings we were building with the wheelbarrow of cement, go up in the elevator, and then push it across a girder. I can't believe I did that. And it was, I thought, oh, this is so much fun, and stuff like that. And then I went to college and medical school and started living with Melanie. Then we got married and was living my life. And I never encountered height. I wasn't avoiding it, but I had no purpose ever to climb up to the top of something. And then I took my kids to Havasupai Canyon one spring. Melanie had to study for her PhD stuff, and it was spring break. And I said, let's go to Arizona. And she said, why don't you take the kids? I've got to study and finish my PhD and everything like this. So I took the kids, and we drove to Havasupai Canyon, where I used to go all the time when I was young. And it's a part of the Grand Canyon. It's a phenomenally beautiful place. It used to be more beautiful. Now it's gotten commercialized, sadly. But there's this beautiful blue-green, you have to go down a cliff and then an 8 or 9 mile trail to get down to the village where there's about 300 Havasupai Indians living. And when I went there was no electricity or anything. Wow. And this blue-green water comes out of the soil and forms a beautiful river. And the blue-green stuff precipitates. So although it's a wide becomes a fast-moving river, it's like a swimming pool. It's all smooth and just like a swimming pool. It's unbelievable. And then we used to go down 2 miles beyond the village and climb down this cliff. And then we could dive. There was a waterfall there, and we would dive through the waterfall, go up behind it. And so we got close to there, and my fear of heights started to come back. And I told the kids, why don't you go down? I'll wait for you up here. Because you have to kind of go down a rope.
Yeah,
and I got to think, oh my God, I don't think I could do that anymore. And what if I fall? And so it took them about an hour to go down and go swimming and talk to the Indian kids who were down there and then climb back with this rope. And as I sat there, my fear of heights escalated to levels I never have imagined before. And it's because I was just thinking, oh my God, I imagine falling and over cliffs and stuff and beating up on myself that I hadn't confronted the fear. And that would be a good example of how when you turn away from the monster becomes vastly more powerful.
Yeah.
So does that answer that at all? What are you guys' thoughts about why exposure is so important, why avoiding your fears makes things worse? Maybe you have an idea about this.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I'll say I'm still working on this. I had, when you were talking to me about this on a hike not that long ago with some decisions that I'm making and had fears about, and it's
and you experience that intensification when avoiding confronting your fear.
Yeah, and in the end,
it was horrible.
It was horrible, and in the end, I didn't actually I still backed down.
Yeah,
and made everything worse.
Yeah.
So my personal experience is that it absolutely, whatever the reason is,
that's what happens.
Yeah.
Well, there's a tremendous, lucid, and amazing explanation for why avoidance makes anxiety worse. And Rhonda will now explain what it is.
Well, because it creates the thought of, or the fear. It keeps that alive. It keeps that alive.
Yeah.
Like I work with a lot of kids who are estranged from one of their divorced parents, and then they start making up stories about their parent that may not be true. And because they're like, oh, I'm not going to see him. I'm mad at him or her, and they did, they blah 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 blah. And I said, well, you might want to talk to him about it. No, and so the anxiety about meeting their parent or making the decision or going on the hike, and if you graph it just keeps going up and up and up and up and up.
The distortions continue.
Yeah, the distortions continue. They live so powerfully within us. And then once you actually confront what it is that you're afraid of, maybe it'll spike the anxiety because you're experiencing something that you've had all these fears about for the longest time. But eventually, there'll be a baseline where you're like, oh yeah, maybe it's not so bad. Oh yeah, oh my God, oh. And then eventually it'll just, kind of poop out.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's not the right word.
Yeah, right. Well, I think the real fun, but yeah.
Eventually it'll just extinguish it.
If you don't confront it, then your negative thoughts will just mushroom.
Yeah.
But the real challenge, I think, is, it's a great metaphor. You standing on the top of the ladder in, what was it, 7th grade or wherever.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't like once you
got
9th
grade. No, 10th grade.
Oh, 10th grade. It wasn't like you got to the top of the ladder and they went away. You had to stick it out, right? I mean, you probably really wanted to go down.
But trust was important because I trusted Mr. Krishak, who was standing at the bottom of the ladder, and say, well, he knows about this stuff, and so I'll do what he's telling me to do. And then it worked. Doing it alone, it would have been very difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah.
Because
it does take a level, maybe not a little, but it takes a lot of courage to face it, because anxiety and the fear might spike, but you have to trust the person that you're with or this process to understand that it'll eventually extinguish.
Well, that was a great question, Mark. I think actually this is Mark Samuelson, to use his last name. And thank you, Mark, for you've sent us other really cool questions too, and we've got them on future Ask Davids. 2 quick statements here. One, if you like the podcast, please tell your friends, your customers, your colleagues, your family members about it, because we're trying to expand our audience. And then secondly, my next workshop in 2020 will be on February 9th, and it's on high-speed methods to reduce resistance and boost motivation. This will be a one-day program designed for mental health professionals to teach these powerful new resistance busting or resistance melting techniques that can really transform your clinical work. And that's one day. It'll be in Palo Alto. You can come in person in Palo Alto, and that's the coolest way to come because we got great food and there's a small group in person. There's great comradeship, but it'll sell out early. So register early if you want to come in person. You can also come online. Mike Christensen from Canada handles the online people. We'll have tons of helpers for the small group exercises online. You'll hear my wonderful colleague, Dr. Jill Levitt, who will be co-leading this workshop with me. So we hope you can join us, and go to my website, feelinggood.com. That's www.feelinggood, FEELINGGOOD, feelinggood.com, and go to the workshop tab, and you can click on the registration tab and get all the details. So hope you can join us.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Dave and David.
Thank you, Rhonda.
Thanks, Rhonda and David.
Thank you, Dave.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this episode under the podcast page. You will also find archives of previous episodes and many resources for therapists and non-therapists. We welcome your comments and questions. If you want to support the show, please share the podcast with people who might benefit from it. You could also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. The theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.